In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing an area of psychology called health psychology, which focuses on stress and how people's stress ends up affecting their health. But before we get started, here's your dad joke / pun of the day. Where did people go for fun during medieval times? A nightclub. Ha 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 ha. All right, let's get started. So as I mentioned, health psychology is a field of psychology that studies the impact that behaviors that people employ typically end up affecting their health. So they're interested in the intersection of behavior and its impacts on health. What's interesting, though, is as we learn more about what causes illnesses, you would think that people would take more responsibility for their own health, take better care of themselves, but that's not always the case. It's really interesting because there are many instances where, despite the known hazards associated with a particular habit or behavior, people continue to engage in those health-harming behaviors, such as people continue to smoke despite the clear links between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And so health psychology studies how people's behaviors and choices influences their health. They might ask questions like why people smoke, as an example, but they might also ask questions like why do people ignore their doctor's advice, especially if it means that they could risk their health. And then how do people cope with pain, chronic pain, and how they choose to reduce it. We're going to be focusing on stress because that is typically what health psychologists study. And stress itself, despite the fact that many people feel or say that they're stressed, it's not an emotion, but it's a physiological response to stimuli in our environment. And experiencing stress can provoke incredibly strong emotions. There are many different ways that stress can affect health. So what psychologists have noticed is that people who've experienced recent stressful events are more likely to get sick. They are also at greater risk of medical problems, ranging from life-threatening illnesses to tooth decay. So how exactly does stress lead to these health problems? One way that stress can affect health is indirectly. What that means is that stress, as people experience it, change their behavior in response to that stress, but those behaviors aren't necessarily promoting good health. So for example, under stress, people might not sleep well, or they might forget to take their medication, or worse, to deal or cope with the stress, they might engage in risky behavior, such as drinking or overeating or not eating well. And so this indirectly, when people engage in behaviors that compromise their health, they're more likely to get sick. But there are also direct effects that stress has on people's health. So when we are stressed, our body releases a stress hormone called cortisol from the adrenal gland that sits right on top of the kidneys. And so when we get stressed, our brain triggers the release of this cortisol, which in acute levels is incredibly helpful because it prepares our body to expend a crap ton of energy. It releases glucose from stored reserves, preparing our bodies to have an indispensable amount of energy. Unfortunately, most of our stress tends to not be acute, but rather chronic. So the physiological effects of chronic cortisol is what ends up damaging the body, causing poor health consequences. So for example, one of the consequences of cortisol exposure, either acute or chronic, is to reduce immune function, right? When we're stressed, our body's not thinking about fighting off microorganisms, rather it's preparing to fight off a bigger life-threatening threat. And so it reduces immune function. What that means is that when we are exposed to germs under stressful conditions, our immune system is not so good at what it should be doing, and so we are more likely to get sick. Chronic cortisol can also deplete energy reserves, leading to exhaustion, right? Our body has limited energy resources, and so chronic cortisol is going to deplete that and those energy reserves, resulting in exhaustion. And then finally, but most importantly, is cortisol gets into our brains, and it binds to receptors, because it is a hormone. It binds to receptors in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is incredibly important for learning and memory. Unfortunately, cortisol, especially in high levels and chronic amounts, can kill off cells of the hippocampus. So it's actually ironic that the brain area students tend to need the most, which is the hippocampus and important for learning and memory, ends up dying as a result of the chronic stress they're likely encountering from their academic experiences. So in other words, take good care of yourself. So many people have linked heart disease to chronic stress. And while that might be true, there was an observation that was made that people with heart disease tend to appear to be more jittery, impatient, and so there was a claim that was made that people with type A personalities differ in their risk of cardiovascular disease. They were arguing that people with type A personality were at greater risk for heart disease compared to type B personality. And if you're not familiar with type A and type B personalities, type A personalities tend to be described as highly competitive, impatient, irritable, hostile, always wanting to win. Type B personalities typically tend to be more easygoing, less hurried, and less hostile. What's interesting is that I tend to kind of envision these stereotypes associated with type A and type B personalities to help me remember which is which. So I tend to think of type A personalities as a kind of like a Wall Street trader who's kind of like highly competitive and always like, trying to trade stocks in a very stressful environment. Whereas type B personality, I envision a more California surfer person, relaxing and chill and not necessarily bothered by very much. There is a correlation between heart disease and type A, but really it's a really weak relationship between heart disease and type A. This is also true of heart disease and chronic anxiety. So people who have chronic anxiety are also at greater risk for heart disease, but this relationship is not very strong. What seems to be the greatest influence on risk for heart disease is actually social support. People who have strong friendships and strong social supports tend to be at less risk for heart disease, and it's thought it's because they take better care of themselves. And so people with lesser social support tend to be at greater risk for heart disease. What's also interesting is that there are variations in the prevalence of heart disease across cultures. So cultures that tend to be really hurried and rushed, people who tend to walk fast, talk fast, and wear watches and are constantly worried about time, the risk of heart disease tends to be higher in those cultures compared to people who have a more kind of relaxed, unrushed, and lack of care for time or lateness. So there seems to be like a cultural relationship between heart disease and kind of the pace of the culture. The heart disease is more common in cultures with a hurried pace, which is kind of our culture, the Western culture. This is the time that we're also going to talk about a very common anxiety or stress disorder. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as you may have heard of it. Post-traumatic stress disorder typically occurs in individuals following a traumatic experience. And what that traumatic experience can really vary, but the idea is that they have experienced some trauma and they might develop symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. So the disorder itself is characterized by profound stress, prolonged anxiety, and often depression. Typically, people who are diagnosed with PTSD are war veterans, victims of rape and assault, survivors of life-threatening accidents and torture, or witness to murder. So you yourself don't have to necessarily have been the recipient or experience of a traumatic situation. Just witnessing a traumatic event can make you develop PTSD. In terms of kind of chronic symptoms, patients who are diagnosed with PTSD often suffer from frequent nightmares and flashbacks. They have outbursts of anger and irritability, unhappiness and guilt, especially survivor's guilt if others that they knew died in the traumatic event and they survived. So there is a lot of guilt associated with it. What to them what to unaffected individuals may seem like no big deal, may cause excessive stress for people with PTSD, even years after the event. But not everybody develops PTSD. There are plenty of people who have experienced traumatic events and don't develop PTSD. And so perhaps those individuals who do develop PTSD have a vulnerability or risk factor within them, making them more likely to develop PTSD following a traumatic event than somebody who doesn't have this vulnerability. There are some factors or variables that scientists have noticed make some people more likely to develop PTSD. So individuals with previous emotional difficulties are at greater risk for developing PTSD following traumatic events. There are specific genes, although they haven't identified a single gene. It's likely a collection of genes conferring risk. Individuals with higher anxiety, again, even before the trauma, are at greater risk. And then finally, most importantly, but also most interestingly, is that prior to the trauma, if people had smaller hippocampi, the same structure we talked about earlier that shrinks with stress, people with smaller hippocampi are more likely to develop PTSD following a traumatic event. So I do want to mention that simply having some of these variables does not guarantee that you will get or develop PTSD following trauma, but it makes it more likely that you will develop PTSD. So these factors represent risk for developing PTSD. So we're at the part in the lecture that things we discuss are completely applicable to you. We all have many different ways that we choose to cope with stress. Sometimes the coping mechanisms people use tend to be more harmful in dealing with a stressful situation. So we're going to be talking about a variety of coping mechanisms or strategies, and the idea is to find the coping strategy that's most appropriate for the situation rather than always going to your go-to coping strategy. How we respond to an event partly depends on the event itself, but also on your interpretation of it. If you're going to interpret the event as stressful, you are going to have a stress response. If you respond to the event as a challenge, you might respond to it differently than being stressed by it. And so your reaction partly seems to depend on your personality. Some people who are more reactive are going to respond to stressful events with, more stressful behaviors. But people who are more relaxed and easygoing might not experience stressful events in the same way. So coping with stress is a process of developing ways that we tend to deal with unexpected events and difficult times, right? So sometimes stress can be predicted, but many times the things that happen to us that can stress us out are unpredicted or unexpected, heightening our stress. So there's 3 categories of coping strategies or coping methods that we're going to expand upon in the next few slides. The first is problem-focused coping. The second is coping by reappraisal. And the last one is emotion-focused coping. I want to highlight that these coping strategies are those highlighted in the textbook that we're using for this course, but there are other coping strategies that people categorize slightly differently than what we have listed in this lecture. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about a bunch of coping strategies that you can use to deal with stress. Having all of them kind of available in your toolkit, ready to use as you need, is important. The best strategy that you use is going to be dependent on the situation that you encounter. And so it's going to be really important that you keep your strategies flexible, right? Rather than always going to the same coping strategy regardless of the situation, it's going to be really important that you utilize the coping strategy that's best suited for the situation that you are in. The first one we're going to talk about today is problem-focused coping. So this coping strategy dealing with stress is trying to do something about the stressful situation. So whether it is trying to identify a solution to the problem or gaining some sense of control, what you're trying to do with problem-focused coping is to kind of attack the stress. And I don't mean literally attack the stress, but deal with it by identifying a solution to reduce the stress. So in an experiment that they did with college students, they had them write down an upsetting experience, and a group of students who didn't write about an upsetting experience, but just to think about it. What they found was really interesting. Those who had written it down ended up showing better health, grades, and less alcohol use. What researchers kind of interpreted those results to mean is that writing about the problem helped or gave students a chance to think about it and evaluate it and plan what they might do about that stressful event the next time, as opposed to the students who were just told to think about the upsetting situation and not really write it down. But unfortunately, writing things down doesn't always help. What helps deal with stress in this problem-focused coping is gaining a sense of control over a situation. When you feel you have control over a stressful situation, it makes that stressful situation less stressful. When hospital patients were told exactly what to expect for a given procedure, they reported less anxiety and they ended up recovering more quickly than patients who weren't told exactly what to expect from a particular procedure. Thinking you have control, even if you don't, can be helpful and decrease stress. So in this experiment, they applied a painfully hot stimulus to participants while they were playing a video game. Some participants, half of them, were told they had control over how painful the hot stimulus was. In fact, nobody had control, but being told they had control, those who thought they had control, reported less pain experiences. In fact, their brains reacted as though they were experiencing less pain. So the idea is, even if you don't have control, thinking that you do, getting a sense of control will make you feel less stressed about the situation. Inoculation is a type of problem-focused coping. It's a strategy that you can use to deal with a stressful event. So again, inoculation is a type of problem-focused coping. It is very similar to what vaccinations do against a virus. If you're not familiar with how vaccinations work, when you get a vaccine, you're getting a small piece of the kind of dead, inactive virus. So your body can build antibodies to detect that virus. When you get exposed to it later on, your body is prepared for it and can fight it off more easily, resulting in no infection. So just like a vaccination, you're getting a small dose of something so that you can, when you're dealing with the real thing, you can deal with it better. So in this kind of problem-focused coping strategy, you're attempting to reduce stress by getting a preview of what you can expect from a stressful situation. So you're exposing yourself to small amounts of the stressful event, or kind of a dress rehearsal to the stressful event. So practicing combat skills under realistic conditions, even though like it's not real combat, it's still practicing combat under realistic conditions where bullets are firing over your head. Or a police trainee is intervening when people are enacting a violent fight, right? Those kinds of situations are going to better prepare you for when the situation is real. So similarly, when you have a presentation to give in a classroom or for a job, you might want to practice with friends or stuffed animals or to yourself as a way to inoculate yourself from that real stressful event. In this particular diagram, you have somebody practicing self-defense skills on a real person so that when they do encounter a real threat, they know what to do to fight off that person. Okay, so we're done with problem-focused coping. We're now going to be talking about coping by reappraisal. You're going to face circumstances where you cannot solve the problem of the stressful situation. There's nothing you can do about the stressful situation. There's no solution. And so one way that you can deal with that kind of stressful situation, one that offers no control, is you can change how you think about that stressful situation, right? Changing our ways of thinking about things or our perspective about things can ultimately make us believe and feel better about a particular situation. So oftentimes when we experience stress, there is an ongoing narrative in our minds about what is happening. We don't pay attention to it, but that narrative ends up influencing how we react to stress. Rethinking or controlling your thought process can end up helping you think about that stressful situation differently. People who recover extremely well from tragedies and defeats say that they want to try to see the positive side of an event, that there was a purpose for experiencing the difficult or challenging situation. Most of us want to have a positive outlook, even when it's not completely accurate. And so reappraisal is one way to do that. Rather than kind of seeing the negative in any stressful situation, can you reframe or reconsider that situation to your advantage? Is there something you can learn from it? Is there a lesson that you've learned or skills that you've gained that you didn't have before? So perhaps you're giving a public speech tomorrow. Are you meeting with your professor for an important meeting? Rather than reframing that the reason why your heart is racing is because you're nervous, you can instead say that you're just excited about it. Because the truth is that when we get nervous or when we get excited, our body's reaction to it is exactly the same. We just have different labels for those bodily reactions given the context or the situation. So we can easily reframe the situation to being more positive, allowing us to get excited about something that we might have viewed as stressful, rather than causing us stress. Our last coping strategy for today is going to be emotion-focused coping. And so again, emotion-focused coping is most applicable when there is no solution or opportunity to control the situation. There's no way to kind of reframe or rethink the situation. And so emotion-focused coping is trying to manage our reaction to the stressful situation. So there are many things you can do to kind of follow an emotion-focused coping strategy. You can choose to suppress your emotions. Many people tend to kind of compartmentalize their emotions associated with a stressful situation and tuck it away behind a wall, behind a dam, whatever you want to call it, in a box. But they tend to just not deal with it. Asian cultures find it less burdensome to deal with stressful emotions, so they just suppress their emotions. You might seek out social support. You might engage in relaxation or exercise, and finally, distraction. We'll expand on all of these in the coming slides. So social support is really important. We've already talked about the fact that social support is one of the important predictors for heart disease, right? This is also true for dealing with stressful situations. It's interesting because across cultures, different people, different cultures choose to use social support to deal with stress. For example, the American culture is one where people tend to seek out social support to deal with stress. Asian cultures do not. They're not one to kind of air their dirty laundry, for example. So they're less likely to seek out social support to deal with stressful situations. Social support is really helpful in many situations. So if you have a recent relationship, it can lessen the stress of watching an unpleasant film. They did an experiment, and that's what you're looking at here on these two graphs. They did an experiment where women were waiting to receive an electric shock, and those women were in one of three conditions. They either had no hand, which was the control condition, they could hold the hand of a spouse, or they could hold the hand of a stranger, and then they measured their body's reaction to those conditions, and they asked the participants to rate the unpleasantness of that particular situation as well. You'll notice that participants that had no hand holding, the control group, had high body arousal and reported highly unpleasant, having to wait to receive a shock. Those who held the hand of a spouse also did really, really well. They rated that as less unpleasant, and their bodies reacted in kind. But here's what was really, really interesting. Those who were allowed to hold the hand of a stranger rated unpleasantness of waiting for that shock to be as equal as the control group, but look and see how their bodies reacted. Their bodies reacted a lot less to holding the hand of a stranger, even though it was unpleasant, suggesting that having that social support, even if it's one from a stranger, is beneficial physiologically for dealing with a stressful situation. You can also engage in meditation, and if you're not at that point in your life where you like to meditate, meditation is a fantastic way to deal with stress. There's a lot of literature showing that it is a terrific way to deal with anxiety, but also long-term reduce the effects of chronic stress. Meditation has also shown powerful changes in the brain. And so this is not kind of like you tricking yourself into feeling more relaxed. Your brain actually changes as a result of meditation. So if you practice it, great. If you want to practice it, also great. And if you don't, there are other ways to kind of deal with emotion-focused coping when you encounter stress. People who practice meditation, other forms of meditation, report that they have less stress, and it does improve their overall health. If you're not into meditation, you can exercise. Exercise is also a powerful way to reduce stress, and you know, it can be as simple as just going on a walk. Like, it doesn't have to be aerobic, and you don't have to get your heart rate up. Of course, that is helpful, and that can reduce stress, but just simply going outside and getting exposure to fresh air and being in nature can help reduce stress. The best approach when you're feeling kind of anxious about an upcoming stressful situation would maybe take that energy from that stress and put it towards exercising, right? Just release that energy and then relax afterwards. Part of the effects of exercise tends to depend on your expectations. If you don't think something's going to work, it will likely not work. So in a particular experiment they did with hotel attendants, these are women or people who kind of turn over your hotel room. They only studied female attendants. In this particular study, they had attendants from 8 different hotels. Half of them were told that whatever they did on a daily basis was as good as, aerobic exercise. The other half was not told that what they did on a daily basis was good exercise. Those that were told that they were getting good exercise actually found benefits from their everyday job, right? So their behaviors didn't change, but their mindset around those behaviors did. And so as a result, those who believed they were getting good exercise not only lost weight, lowered their blood pressure, they also decreased their body mass index, or their BMI. So if you believe that exercise is going to help reduce stress, it's going to be more likely to reduce stress. Finally, when all else fails, you can choose distraction. Distraction is one way that many people deal with stress because it's super easy to deal with stress. Unfortunately, many people go to this type of distraction even when other coping strategies would be more appropriate. Distraction is helpful in certain situations, and so it's really important to decide which coping strategy is best given the situation that you're in. If you're always going to choose distraction, such as like rather than dealing with preparing for a test that you're stressed about, you're choosing to binge watch TV shows, that kind of distraction is more avoidant behavior, which is also a coping strategy. And there are clear correlations between avoidant coping strategies and mental health concerns like increased anxiety and depression. So distraction's helpful when there's nothing you can do about your stress, but when you can do something about your stress, I would encourage you to choose other coping strategies instead. So in a particular experiment, they had hospitalized patients be distracted when they were likely to experience a painful procedure. Those individuals handled pain much, much better if they were distracted with a nice view or music or some other activities that took their mind off of the procedure that was likely to be very painful. Just like exercise, the effectiveness of the distraction is going to depend on a person's expectations. College students were told that listening to music could reduce pain. Other half was told that the music didn't do anything for their pain. Those who were told that listening to music can reduce their pain ended up tolerating the pain of sticking their hand in ice water more than those who were told that listening to music was not really effective at reducing pain. So believing that something is going to do something is kind of half the battle in making it actually work. So here's your summary for today's lecture. Stress affects health indirectly because people exposed to it change their behavior, but it can also affect it directly through the release of cortisol. There's only a small link between emotional responses and the onset of heart disease. After a traumatic experience, some people have long-lasting changes and can develop PTSD. Most strategies for dealing with stress fall into one of the 3 categories we talked about: trying to fix the problem or getting some sort of control over the problem, reappraisal, which is rethinking or reframing the stressful situation, and then finally trying to manage or navigate the emotions that come up when we encounter a stressful situation. Here are your exit ticket questions for this lecture, and that's it.